Good morning, children. Today we will begin with a new chapter, Neural Control and Coordination. Now, what is coordination? It is the process through which two or more organs interact and complement the functions of one another. The nervous system provides the fastest means of communication within the body so that suitable responses to stimuli can be made at once. We will study about the divisions of the nervous system. The nervous system in man is divided into two main divisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. You can see in the chart that is given below that the nervous system, the human nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is present along the axis of the body and consists of two parts, namely the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system can be further divided into voluntary and involuntary nervous system. Voluntary means consisting of those activities that are under our control, and involuntary those activities which are not under our control. It is composed of cranial and spinal nerves, the peripheral nervous system. So now you see here the central nervous system consisting of brain and spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system consisting of sensory and motor neurons. Now this peripheral nervous system can be further divided, as I told you, into voluntary and involuntary, and is composed of cranial and spinal nerves. As the very name says, the cranial nerves, they arise from the brain, and spinal nerves originate from the spinal cord. The involuntary nervous system or the autonomic nervous system consists of sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, which are opposite to one another in function. So this was the chart showing the human nervous system. Now we begin with the human brain. Now, as I told you, the central nervous system consists of brain and spinal cord. So we begin with the human brain. Now, the average adult human brain weighs 1.4 kg, about 3.1 pounds, or about 2% of the total body weight. Despite its relatively small mass, it contains about 100 billion neurons. Now, if we come to the anatomy of the human brain, it is divisible into three parts: the forebrain or the prosencephalon, the midbrain or mesencephalon represented by the optic lobes, corpora quadrigemina and crura cerebri, and the hindbrain or rhombencephalon, which consists of cerebellum, pons varolai and medulla oblongata. So now we'll study about the different parts of the brain, and the chart will give you all the details. Brain divided into forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. The forebrain is divided into olfactory bulb, cerebrum and the diencephalon. The midbrain into tectum, cerebral peduncle and substantia nigra, and hindbrain into cerebellum, pons varolai and medulla oblongata. The cerebrum is again divided into four lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, and the diencephalon into epithalamus, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So this is the flow chart of which shows the major components of the human brain. Now we come to the structure of the human brain or the anatomy of the human brain. Now you can see the external view of a human brain, and as I told you, it weighs about 1.4 kg or about 2% of the total body weight. And despite its relatively small mass, it consists about 100 billion neurons or nerve cells, which are the unit of the brain. It is enclosed in a brain box or the cranium and is surrounded by three protective membranes and the outer dura mater, middle arachnoid matter and inner pia mater. Okay. These membranes are collectively called as meninges. Once again I repeat, the three protective membranes: outer dura mater, middle arachnoid matter and inner pia mater, and these are collectively called meninges. The space between the pia mater and arachnoid matter is filled with a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, which also fills the ventricles or the cavities of the brain. Likewise, the space between the dura mater and arachnoid matter is filled with another fluid called the arachnoid fluid. The meninges and these fluids protect the brain from external shocks and jerks. Besides protecting the brain from shocks, the cerebrospinal fluid performs some other functions like supplying nutrients to different tissues of the brain, collecting waste products from different tissues of the brain, and maintaining the pressure within the brain. Okay, now we begin with the forebrain. Forebrain or prosencephalon consists of cerebrum, thalamus and hypothalamus. The forebrain or prosencephalon consists of cerebrum, thalamus and hypothalamus. So first we will come to the cerebrum. It makes up about 2/3 of the human brain and consists of two cerebral hemispheres joined by a curved thick band of nerve fibers called corpus callosum. So this cerebrum, it has got two cerebral hemispheres joined by a thick band of nerve fibers which are called corpus callosum. The outer layer of the cerebrum is called cerebral cortex. Okay, it's called the cerebral cortex and is formed of grey matter and the inner of white matter. Grey matter shows many convolutions in the cerebral hemisphere. You can see a number of convolutions here in the cerebral hemispheres, and these convolutions are called gyri and are separated by depressions called sulci. Gyri increase the surface area of the cortex for accommodating more nerve cells in it. Gyri and sulci impart characteristic appearance to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral hemisphere is divided into three wide and deep fissures into frontal, parietal, temporal and occipital lobes. The central sulcus lies between the frontal and parietal lobe, and the lateral sulcus between the temporal and the frontotemporal lobes. The highest center of motor activities and sensory functions is in the cerebral cortex, and the center of special senses occur in the cortex. The general sensory or somasthetic area in the parietal lobe is the seat for perception of general sensations like pain, touch and temperature. The motor area in the frontal lobe controls the voluntary movement of muscles. The premotor area in the frontal lobes is the center for involuntary movement of muscles and for the autonomic nervous system. The visual area in the occipital lobe is the center for visual sensation, and the auditory area in the occipital lobe is the center for hearing. The prefrontal area in the frontal lobe is concerned with intellectual activities. Memory, learning, intelligence and judgment depend on the coordinated and integrated activities of neurons of several cortical centers. Cerebral cortex is the most important part in the central nervous system and the whole body. And the cerebral control in the body is contralateral. That is, one half is related to the functions in the opposite side of the body. Okay, if it is concerned with one side, you call it ipsilateral, but here cerebral control is contralateral. That is, one half is related to functions in the opposite side of the body. Then we come to the thalamus. Thalamus. Now see the thalamus here. You can see the thalamus in this diagram. The cerebrum wraps around a structure called thalamus, which is a major coordinating center for sensory and motor signaling. Then we come to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus lies at the base of the thalamus. It is visible in the ventral view of the brain and consists of masses of grey matter called nuclei, a collection of nerve cells. Along with thalamus, the hypothalamus forms diencephalon. A cross of two optic nerves is present in front of the hypothalamus and it is called optic chiasma. Okay, so you can see that a cross of two optic nerves is present in front of the hypothalamus and you call it the optic chiasma. A pair of small rounded bodies called mammillary bodies are present behind the hypothalamus. From the region of the median eminence of hypothalamus hangs the pituitary gland. So you can see that the region of the median eminence of hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, hangs by its stalk. Hypothalamus contains a number of centers which control body temperature, urge for eating and drinking, and it is the highest center of the autonomic nervous system. Stimulation of its selective areas causes widespread sympathetic activity. It controls emotional reaction, it is concerned with sleep mechanism and exerts control over the endocrine system at the highest level. So you can see the importance of the hypothalamus. It also secretes neurohormones. You call them the hypothalamic hormones, and they control the secretions of anterior pituitary hormones. Anterior pituitary in turn regulates many different endocrine glands which control metabolism, sexual development, reproductive physiology, growth. Thus, through the anterior pituitary, hypothalamus has a strong control over metabolism, growth and reproduction. Now, hypothalamus also produces ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, which are released when required from the posterior pituitary. So, it thus strongly influences water preservation and parturition or childbirth. So, ADH is controlling water preservation, oxytocin is concerned with parturition or childbirth. Okay, the inner part of the cerebral hemisphere and a group of associated deep structures like amygdala, hippocampus form a complex structure called the limbic lobe. Along with the hypothalamus, it is involved in the regulation of sexual behavior, expression of emotional reactions and motivation. Now we begin with the midbrain. The midbrain is located between the thalamus and hypothalamus of the forebrain and pons of the hindbrain. The midbrain is significantly small and consists of two heavy fiber tracts known as cerebral peduncles, crura cerebri on the ventral side. There are two swellings, superior and inferior colliculi, on each side of the dorsal surface. The superior and inferior caliculi of each side are referred to as corpora bigemina. So children, the superior and inferior caliculi of each side are referred to as corpora bigemina. That is, on one side you call it corpora bigemina, and of both the sides corpora quadrigemina. So you can see here corpora quadrigemina. Cerebral peduncles are bundles of fibers and they connect the cerebral cortex with other parts of the brain and spinal cord. Midbrain also contains groups of nerve cells scattered in the white matter. Some of these nuclei or the nerve cells control muscle tone and modify certain motor activities initiated by the cortex. Now, corpora quadrigemina, what does it do? It serves as the center for certain visual and auditory reflexes. whereas the cerebral peduncles act as coordination centers between the hindbrain and the forebrain. So there is a coordination between hind and forebrain through the midbrain and through the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. A canal called the cerebral aqueduct passes through the midbrain. Now we come to the hindbrain or the rhombencephalon. So now we begin with hindbrain. It is the posterior most part of the brain and it is in continuity with the spinal cord and consists of three parts: cerebellum, medulla oblongata and pons varolai. Okay, medulla oblongata, pons varolai, midbrain and hypothalamus are collectively called as brainstem. So medulla oblongata, pons varolai, midbrain and hypothalamus, together you call them the brainstem and are hidden by the cerebrum and cerebellum. Now we come to the first part of the hindbrain, and that is cerebellum. Cerebellum, also called the small brain, is only 1/8 the size of the cerebrum and lies under the occipital lobe dorsal to the brainstem and is connected with the brainstem by means of three pairs of peduncles: the superior, the middle and the inferior peduncle. Like cerebrum, cerebellum also has on its outer surface the cerebral cortex consisting of grey matter and in its deeper center the medulla made up of white matter. Cerebral nuclei make up the grey matter and are also scattered in white matter. Now we come to the function of the cerebellum. It mainly controls the balance and the posture of the body, and its control is ipsilateral. Like in cerebrum, I told you that its control was contralateral. Here it is ipsilateral. Cerebellum control is ipsilateral, that is over half of the body on the same side, and it also modulates and operates voluntary movements initiated by the cerebral cortex. Now we come to medulla oblongata. We are starting about the hindbrain. We have done the cerebellum, then the second part is medulla and the third is pons. So medulla oblongata is the posterior most part of the brain and it continues with the spinal cord. Okay, you can see that it is continuing with the spinal cord. Okay, most of the sensory and motor fibers cross it from one side to the other. That is why the left cerebral hemisphere controls the right side of the body and vice versa. Several medullary centers or reflex centers are situated in medulla oblongata for controlling functions of important organs like the cardiac center for controlling the heart, the vasomotor center for the blood vessels, the respiratory center, etc. So the reflex centers for swallowing, coughing, sneezing and vomiting are also located in the medulla oblongata. Now we come to pons varolai. On the ventral side of the brain, just below the cerebellum, a thick bundle of fibers are present called pons varolai. They carry impulses from one hemisphere of the cerebellum to the other, thus coordinating muscle movements of the two sides of the muscle body. Now we come to the last topic in this, and that is the cavities of the brain. The brain is a somewhat hollow structure containing many cavities of various sizes, and these cavities are said to be ventricles. So you can see in the diagram the two lateral ventricles, the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. And these are cavities. Each cerebral hemisphere, you can see the cerebral hemisphere enclosing a cavity called the lateral ventricle. The two lateral ventricles, also called the first and second ventricles, are closed on the front but open behind into the third ventricle of the thalamus. So you can see the third ventricle, it is present in the region of the thalamus by a common aperture called foramen of Monro. The third ventricle of the thalamus communicates posteriorly with the fourth ventricle of the medulla oblongata by way of a narrow passage called iter, present in the midbrain. The fourth ventricle is formed by the enlargement of the central canal of the spinal cord. There are three small apertures which are also present in its roof, through which the cerebrospinal fluid can pass into the meningeal spaces. Thus, all ventricles of the brain, that means they are continuous and they are lined by an epithelium and contain cerebrospinal fluid. Now, what is the function of this fluid? It acts as a shock-proof cushion for the brain and spinal cord and keeps them moist, and forms a medium for exchange of food materials, waste products, respiratory gases and other substances with neurons, and maintains a constant pressure inside the cranium. So with this we complete brain, and in our next class we will study about the spinal cord in great detail. Thank you.